Having good hip mobility is important for many of the things that we do in the gym, such as squatting, snatching, and doing lunges. Having limitations in the mobility and flexibility of our hips can lead to issues such as limited squat depth, decreased performance in some of our lifts, and sometimes it can actually be a contributor to pain and injuries as well. When discussing hip mobility for lifting, there are 4 main movements that we need to discuss. Those are hip flexion, hip extension, hip internal rotation, and hip external rotation. Hip flexion happens when the thigh comes towards our body, while hip extension happens when our thigh moves behind our body. Hip internal rotation happens when the thigh rotates towards the midline of our body, and hip external rotation happens when the thigh rotates away from the midline of our body. Now let's cover some examples of hip flexibility and hip mobility demands while lifting. In order to squat to depth, you're going to need a certain amount of hip flexion. For a squat in which you're just breaking parallel, as is commonly seen in powerlifting training, you only need a moderate amount of hip flexion, usually just a little bit more than 90 degrees. But for a full depth squat, such as in CrossFit and Olympic weightlifting training, you're going to need a lot more hip flexion flexibility, typically 120 to 130 degrees of range of motion. Depending upon your squat stance and width, you're also going to need varying levels of hip internal rotation as well. The wider your stance is and the lower you squat to, the more hip internal rotation you're going to need. On the other hand, you'll need less hip internal rotation if you squat with a narrower stance or if you use a shorter range of motion. For lunges and split jerks, you're going to need adequate hip extension, while for things like sumo deadlifts, you're going to need adequate hip external rotation. Next, we're going to cover a drill to improve the flexibility and mobility for each of these 4 movements, as well as how to progress each of these drills. Each progression will start with a passive stretch or mobilization, and then move to an active stretch or mobilization, and end with a loaded flexibility or mobility drill. To improve hip flexion, we're going to start with a supine banded hip flexion mobilization. To perform this drill, you're going to attach a thick band around a squat rack or other immovable object. You're going to place the other end of this band up against your thigh as high in the hip crease as you can get it. From here, you're going to lie on your back away from the ankle point so that there's tension on the band. Finally, you're going to pull your knee as far towards your chest as you can with your arms, holding the stretch for 30 to 60 seconds, or performing sets of 10 to 15 dynamic reps. To progress this into a more active drill, we're going to do a half kneeling hip flexor liftoff. Set up a couple of plates or a low box in front of you. Then get in a half kneeling position with the foot of the side that you're working up on the object. From here, brace your core hard so that the only thing that's moving is your hip, and then lift your foot as high up off that object as you can. Hold this position for 5 to 10 seconds before returning to the starting position, performing 3 sets of 5 to 6 reps. The final drill in the hip flexion progression is a tempo front foot elevated split squat. Set up a few plates or box just like you did with the last drill. Then get into a split squat position with the foot of the leg that you're working up on the object. Grab some extra weight in one or both hands and slowly drop down into the bottom of a split squat, holding this for a 3 to 5 second count before returning to the starting position. Perform this drill for 3 sets of 6 to 8 reps per side. To improve hip internal rotation, we're going to start with a 90-90 hip internal rotation stretch. To perform this drill, we're going to sit on the ground in a 90-90 position with the back leg being the target leg for the stretch. Support yourself on your hands and then turn your torso and chest towards the back leg to stretch into hip internal rotation. Hold this position for 30 to 60 seconds or perform sets of 10 to 15 dynamic reps. To progress this drill, we're going to do a 90-90 hip internal rotation liftoff. You're going to get into the same position as before, but keep your torso straight ahead instead of turning to the back leg. From here, you're going to keep your knee on the floor and then lift your back foot up as far from the floor as you can. Hold this for 5 to 10 seconds before returning to the starting position, performing 3 sets of 5 to 6 reps. And the last drill in the hip internal rotation progression is a supine 90-90 banded hip internal rotation. To perform this drill, you're going to lie on your back with your legs in a 90-90 position and your feet on the wall. Have a band wrapped around your ankles and a foam roller in between your knees. From here, you're going to rotate one foot as far away from the other as possible, holding for 5 to 10 seconds before returning to the starting position. Perform 3 sets of 5 to 6 reps per side. To improve hip external rotation, we're going to start with a seated 90-90 hip external rotation stretch. You're going to get into the same position as you did for the 90-90 hip internal rotation stretch, except this time we're focusing on the front side leg. To stretch the front hip into external rotation, you're simply going to point your torso so that your knee is in line with your chest, keep your back straight, and then lean your chest over your knee, getting a good stretch in the lateral hip. Hold this stretch for 30 to 60 seconds, or perform sets of 10 to 15 dynamic reps. To progress this drill, we're going to perform seated 90-90 hip external rotation liftoffs. Start in the same position as the external rotation stretch, except this time keep the knee on the ground and lift the foot as far away from the floor as possible. Hold this position for 5 to 10 seconds before returning to the starting position, performing 3 sets of 5 to 6 reps. To progress this into a loaded stretch, we're simply going to perform the same movement as we did during the 90-90 hip external rotation stretch, but this time we're going to be holding a weight against our chest and moving in and out of the stretch position for 3 sets of 8 to 12 reps. And lastly, we're going to start the hip extension progression with a half kneeling hip extension stretch. We're going to get into a half kneeling position with the knee of the side that we're stretching on the floor. Unlike a typical hip flexor stretch where we place the pelvis into a posterior pelvic tilt to maximally stretch the muscles, we're going to keep the pelvis in a neutral position and focus on extending the hip as much as possible. Hold the stretch for 30 to 60 seconds or perform sets of 10 to 15 reps. To progress this into an active drill, we're going to do prone hip extension liftoffs. To perform this drill, you're going to be lying on your stomach with your knee bent and foot facing the ceiling. From here, brace your core hard to limit any movement from the lower back, and then kick your foot up towards the ceiling, extending your hip as far as possible. Hold this for 5 to 10 seconds before returning to the starting position, performing 3 sets of 5 to 6 reps. And the last drill in this progression is another variation of a front foot elevated split squat, but with your legs in a very long stance. After you've set yourself up in the split squat with a wider than typical stance, you're going to drive your body forwards and down, stretching your back hip into as much extension as is comfortable. Hold for 3 to 5 seconds before returning to the starting position and perform 3 sets of 6 to 8 reps per side. We recommend using at least one of these drills for each of the movements that you struggle with, but you will likely get the best results by combining a passive drill with an active or loaded drill as well. If you found this to be helpful, please hit that like button, leave any questions that you might have in the comments below so that we can answer them, and make sure to subscribe to our channel for more content just like this.